April 1945. The bridge over the River Elbe stood as one of the last defensive positions in a crumbling Third Reich. German soldiers watched the skies nervously, knowing that at any moment formations of Allied bombers could appear on the horizon. But stationed on this bridge was something unusual, something that military historian Ian Hogg would later describe as sounding like it came straight out of a comic strip. A massive bent tube, 35 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, mounted on what appeared to be railway cars. This was the Windkanone, the Windkanone, one of Adolf Hitler's most bizarre wonder weapons. And this bridge over the Elbe would be its only battlefield deployment. It would achieve exactly nothing. The story of how Germany came to deploy a cannon that fired compressed air at enemy aircraft is a story about desperation, about the gap between scientific theory and battlefield reality, and about how a nation's resources can be squandered chasing technological miracles when conventional solutions might have served better. This is the story of the Windkanone sound cannon, how it was conceived, tested, and deployed in the dying days of Nazi Germany. By 1943, the skies over Germany had become a nightmare. Day after day, night after night, the Allied bomber streams came. American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators by day, flying in massive formations that could number over 1,000 aircraft. British Lancaster and Halifax bombers by night, carrying tons of incendiary bombs that turned German cities into infernos. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, was being systematically destroyed. Its fighter pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of combat hours, were dying at unsustainable rates. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Production facilities were being bombed. Germany's once formidable air defences were collapsing under the weight of Allied air superiority. In February 1944, during what became known as Big Week, the United States Army Air Forces and Royal Air Force dropped over 16,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft production facilities in just 6 days. The Luftwaffe lost 160 fighters in a single day attempting to defend against these raids. While Germany managed to increase fighter production through dispersal to smaller factories hidden in caves and tunnels, the loss of experienced pilots could not be replaced. By 1945, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience, while Allied pilots arrived with over 400 hours of training. Against this backdrop of aerial devastation, Adolf Hitler became increasingly desperate for wonder weapons, Wunderwaffe, that could turn the tide. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket were already in production, striking at London and other Allied cities. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, the world's first operational jet-powered aircraft, was entering service, though too late and in too few numbers to matter. Hitler's appetite for revolutionary weapons knew no bounds. If conventional anti-aircraft guns couldn't stop the bomber streams, then perhaps unconventional weapons could. This is where Mario Zippermeyer enters the story. Born in Milan, Italy on April 25, 1899, to Austrian parents, Zippermeyer was a physicist who had earned his doctorate in engineering in 1927 and his habilitation in physics in 1938. He was also a committed Nazi, having joined the Austrian Nazi Party in 1933 and the SS Security Service, the SD, in 1938. Starting around 1942, Zippermeyer established a research institute with approximately 35 employees, with facilities in both Vienna and Lofer in the Salzburg region. Zippermeyer was working on several unconventional weapons projects. His main focus was on what he called the Hexenkessel, the witch's cauldron, a fuel-air explosive device that used coal dust and liquid oxygen to create devastating explosions. But Zippermeyer's creative mind wasn't limited to explosives. He had become fascinated with the idea of using air itself as a weapon. He had observed how tornadoes and powerful wind vortices could bring down aircraft, how sudden changes in air pressure could damage structures, how concentrated blasts of compressed air could inflict surprising amounts of damage. What if these natural phenomena could be weaponized? Germany wasn't alone in exploring unconventional anti-aircraft weapons. The increasingly frequent Allied bombing raids had pushed military planners to consider ideas that in peacetime would have been immediately dismissed. As Ian Hogg would later note, Germany's desperate situation meant that proposals which normally would have been quashed as soon as they appeared were instead taken seriously. When you're losing the war and conventional weapons aren't working, even comic strip science starts to look worth investigating. Zippermeyer actually developed 2 distinct air-based weapon systems, and it's important to understand the difference between them. The first was his vortex cannon, also called the Windkanone or Windkanone. This was a large mortar barrel sunk into the ground that fired shells containing coal dust and slow-burning explosives. The idea was that these shells would create artificial tornado-like vortices that could knock aircraft out of the sky. Tests showed that in ideal conditions, the device could indeed create considerable vortex effects, but whether these would be powerful enough to disable a fast-moving aircraft at altitude remained uncertain. The second weapon was the Windkanone proper, the Windkanone, and this is the weapon that would actually be deployed to the Elbe Bridge. The Windkanone was conceptually different from the vortex cannon. Instead of trying to create tornado-like spinning air masses, it was designed to fire concentrated slugs or plugs of compressed air, like invisible cannonballs made of atmosphere, directly at enemy aircraft. The design was produced at a factory in Stuttgart. The weapon consisted of a large cast iron tube, 35 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. The tube had a distinctive bent shape, like an arm bent at the elbow, with one end angled upward at approximately 90 degrees. This bent configuration was essential to the weapon's operation, allowing the compressed air blast to be directed vertically or at high angles toward aircraft overhead. The entire assembly rested in what was described as an immense cradle, presumably to allow for aiming and to handle the recoil forces generated when the weapon fired. The operating principle was elegantly simple, even if the execution proved problematic. The cannon worked by igniting critical mixtures of hydrogen and oxygen inside the barrel's combustion chamber. When these gases detonated, they created an extremely powerful explosion that generated a rapidly expanding wave of compressed air and water vapor. This compressed air projectile would then be channeled through the long barrel and expelled from the angled opening at tremendous velocity. The explosion effectively created what some writers described as plugs of air, though the reality was more complex. What was actually happening was the creation of a shock wave, a region of compressed and high-velocity air that travelled as a cohesive mass through the atmosphere. The theoretical basis wasn't entirely unsound. Compressed air can indeed carry significant force. Anyone who has experienced the overpressure wave from an explosion knows that moving air can knock people down, shatter windows and damage structures. The question was whether this force could be concentrated and directed effectively enough over sufficient distance to damage or destroy an aircraft in flight. In 1943 and 1944, the weapon was taken to the Hillersleben artillery proving ground for testing. Hillersleben, located in what is now Saxony-Anhalt, was one of Germany's major weapons testing facilities. It was here that many of Germany's most advanced and unconventional weapons were evaluated, from super-heavy artillery to experimental tank designs. The Windkanone would undergo its trial by fire at this sprawling test range. The test at Hillersleben involved firing the cannon at stationary ground targets to measure its destructive potential. According to multiple sources, including post-war intelligence reports and historical accounts, the cannon successfully broke wooden boards at a distance of 200 meters. Different sources give slightly varying details, some reporting that 25mm thick boards were broken, others noting that 1-inch thick plywood boards were shattered. Ian Hogg's account mentions that the weapon could break boards up to 100mm, about 4 inches thick, at a range of 180 meters. To better observe and document what was happening, the German researchers deployed an interesting experimental technique. They added nitrogen peroxide to some of the hydrogen-oxygen mixtures. Nitrogen peroxide has a distinctive brown colour, which meant that the otherwise invisible compressed air projectile could be tracked visually and photographed as it travelled through the air. This allowed the scientists to observe the path and destination of their air slugs, to see how they travelled, how they dissipated, and where they struck. The results were impressive in their own way. The tests proved that a powerful region of compressed and high-velocity air could indeed be deployed with sufficient force to inflict damage on ground structures. A blast of air travelling at several hundred miles per hour, concentrated in a relatively narrow column, carried real destructive power. The rapid compression and decompression could shatter wood, potentially damage light structures, and theoretically cause harm to aircraft if it could hit them. But there was an enormous gap between breaking wooden boards on a test range and shooting down enemy bombers at 20,000 feet. The German researchers knew this, but in the context of 1944, with Allied bombers pounding German cities into rubble, even marginal improvements in air defence were worth pursuing. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, observed the tests closely. Every phenomenon that could potentially bring down Allied bombers received serious attention. The fundamental problems with the Windkanone as an anti-aircraft weapon were numerous and severe. First, there was the issue of range. The cannon had demonstrated effectiveness out to perhaps 200 metres, roughly 650 feet. This is an extraordinarily short range for an anti-aircraft weapon. Allied bombers typically operated at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, more than 4 miles high. Even when bombers came in lower for specific tactical missions, they rarely descended below several thousand feet. The Windkanone would need an aircraft to practically fly directly overhead at extremely low altitude to have any chance of hitting it. Second, there was the problem of targeting. The weapon had been tested only against stationary targets, boards mounted on stands that weren't moving. An aircraft is a small, fast-moving target. By 1944, even older aircraft could fly at 200 to 300 miles per hour. Newer fighters could exceed 400 miles per hour. Calculating the lead, the angle of deflection needed to hit a moving target with a projectile, even a conventional shell, is complex. Hitting a fast-moving aircraft with an invisible, rapidly dissipating mass of compressed air that lacked a ballistic trajectory was exponentially more difficult. Third, atmospheric dispersion was a critical issue. The compressed air projectiles weren't solid objects. They were regions of temporarily compressed atmosphere. The moment they left the barrel, they began to dissipate, spreading out and losing coherence. The further they travelled, the more they spread and the weaker they became. Wind, temperature variations, humidity, all of these factors would affect how the air slug travelled and how quickly it lost effectiveness. What worked in the controlled environment of a proving ground might behave very differently in actual atmospheric conditions. Fourth, the aerodynamics of an aircraft in flight might actually protect it. An aircraft moving through the air creates its own complex patterns of airflow, turbulence, and pressure changes. The airframe is designed to handle turbulent air, sudden wind shear, and atmospheric disturbances. While a sudden blast of compressed air might theoretically destabilize an aircraft's flight, actually achieving enough concentrated force to do so at any meaningful distance was questionable. Despite these obvious limitations, a decision was made at some point in late 1944 or early 1945 to deploy the Windkanone in actual combat conditions. One cannon was removed from the Hillesleben test facility and transported to a bridge crossing the River Elbe. The exact location of this bridge isn't specified in most sources, but the deployment occurred in 1945 as Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west. The decision to deploy the weapon to a bridge location makes a certain tactical sense, even if the weapon itself was of dubious value. Bridges were critical infrastructure, vital for military movement and supply. The Allies had made bridges priority targets for their tactical aircraft. Fighter bombers routinely attacked bridges to disrupt German logistics. A bridge would be a location where aircraft might come in lower, making attack runs against the structure, potentially bringing them into the Windkanone's very limited engagement envelope. We can imagine the scene, the massive bent tube mounted on its railway car chassis, positioned on or near the bridge. German soldiers manning the weapon, loading the hydrogen and oxygen fuel, preparing to fire at any Allied aircraft that appeared. The tension of watching the skies, knowing that at any moment American P-47 Thunderbolts or British Typhoons could come roaring in, their cannons and rockets ready to blow the bridge to pieces. And then the aircraft did come. Allied tactical aircraft were everywhere by 1945, dominating German skies. But when they appeared over this particular bridge, whether they were too high, too fast, or the Windkanone crew simply couldn't get a shot off, the result was the same. The weapon failed to achieve any results. Not a single aircraft was reported damaged or downed by the Windkanone during its brief operational deployment. Historical accounts are remarkably unanimous on this point. The Imperial War Museum's records state that in 1945 a wind cannon was installed on a bridge over the River Elbe but failed to achieve any results. Multiple sources note that the weapon was either never fired at actual aircraft, or if it was fired, had absolutely no effect. The Nevington War Museum's documentation states simply that the cannon was installed on a bridge over the Elbe with no significant results. The weapon that had seemed so promising on the test range, that had shattered thick wooden boards, proved completely ineffective against its intended targets. There are several possible explanations for this complete failure. The most likely is that Allied aircraft simply never came within effective range. Pilots who had survived years of combat were experts at reading ground threats. Anti-aircraft gun positions were obvious and were attacked from angles and altitudes that minimized exposure. If the Windkanone was visible on or near the bridge, Allied pilots would have simply avoided it, attacking from outside its limited range or not attacking the bridge at all if it appeared too heavily defended. It's also possible that the weapon did fire at aircraft, but the compressed air slugs simply dissipated harmlessly before reaching their targets. What worked at 200 meters on a calm day at a proving ground might have been completely ineffective at even slightly longer ranges or in actual combat conditions, with wind, weather and maneuvering targets. There's even the possibility, suggested by some sources, that by the time the Windkanone was deployed, there simply weren't many Allied aircraft in that particular area, or that the rapid advance of Allied ground forces meant the bridge position was quickly overrun before the weapon could be tested in action. When Allied forces finally captured the bridge and its bizarre defensive weapon, they must have been baffled. Intelligence officers and technical specialists would have been called in to examine this strange bent tube to try to understand what the Germans had been thinking. Photos were taken, including one that survives showing the experimental Windkanone on the gun park at the German artillery testing range at Hillersleben in May 1945, after Allied forces had captured the facility. The discovery of the Windkanone was just one of many strange finds as Allied forces overran German territory in the final months of the war. At Hillersleben alone, they found an entire museum of experimental weapons, prototypes, and failed projects. The massive Schwerer Gustav railway gun, super heavy tanks, experimental aircraft, rockets, and all manner of devices that represented Germany's desperate attempts to find a technological solution to its military defeats. In the post-war interrogation and technical intelligence gathering, Mario Zippermeyer was interviewed by Allied personnel. According to later accounts, Zippermeyer willingly answered questions about his work. He detailed how the hollow pipe could produce dispersal patterns of coal dust for his vortex weapons, and explained the principles behind the Windkanone. American visitors included Leslie Earl Simon, head of the US Ballistic Research Laboratory, who was interested in understanding German weapons research. Interestingly, while Zippermeyer was cooperative with Allied investigators, he did not follow the path of many German scientists who went to work for either the United States or the Soviet Union after the war. He remained in Lofer and eventually shifted his work in an unexpected direction. He developed what he called a climate therapeutic method for treating respiratory diseases, using high-voltage electric discharges to create artificial mountain air. His therapeutic work, especially with whooping cough and respiratory problems, was apparently successful enough that in 1953 he moved to Kremsmünster in Upper Austria and opened a medical practice. He died there on January 13, 1979. His wartime weapons work largely forgotten outside specialist circles. The Windkanone represents a particular type of weapons development failure. It wasn't a complete fantasy. The underlying physics was sound. Compressed air can damage structures, but the gap between theoretical possibility and practical battlefield effectiveness was never bridged. The weapon couldn't engage targets at meaningful ranges, couldn't track and hit fast-moving aircraft, and couldn't generate sufficient concentrated force at the altitudes where enemy bombers operated. What makes the Windkanone story particularly interesting is what it reveals about Germany's strategic situation in the final years of the war. Resources that might have been used to produce more conventional anti-aircraft guns, more fighter aircraft, more ammunition, more fuel, were instead diverted to experimental weapons that had little chance of affecting the outcome. The man-hours spent designing, building, testing and deploying the Windkanone, the steel and other materials used in its construction, the personnel assigned to man it, all of these resources were effectively wasted. This wasn't unique to the Windkanone. Germany's wonder weapon programs consumed enormous resources. The V2 rocket program, for instance, cost far more than it inflicted in damage. Each V2 cost as much as 10 V1 flying bombs, but was less effective as a weapon. The development of super-heavy tanks like the Maus consumed resources that could have built hundreds of more practical medium tanks. The massive railway guns, while impressive as engineering achievements, were tactically limited and required enormous support infrastructure. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, later noted that the development of wonder weapons often represented Hitler's desire for the spectacular over the practical. Hitler wanted weapons that matched his grandiose vision of German technological supremacy. He wanted weapons that could strike terror, that would seem magical and unstoppable. A cannon that fired invisible bullets of compressed air that could pluck aircraft from the sky, that fit Hitler's vision, even if it didn't fit reality. Military historian Ian Hogg's assessment that the Windkanone sounded like something out of a comic strip was accurate but also insightful. There's a science fiction quality to the weapon, an element of fantastical thinking that suggests its proponents were more enamored with the novelty of the concept than concerned with practical effectiveness. In peacetime, with unlimited resources and time, the Windkanone might have been an interesting research project, a way to explore the physics of shock waves and compressed air. In wartime, with Germany collapsing under the weight of Allied military superiority, it was a distraction. The contrast between German and Allied approaches to air defense technology is instructive. While Germany was testing air cannons and vortex generators, the Allies were focusing on improving conventional systems. Better radar, proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits, improved fire control systems, more anti-aircraft guns deployed in greater numbers. These practical improvements in existing technology proved far more effective than pursuing revolutionary but unproven concepts. It's worth noting that the idea of using directed acoustic or pressure waves as weapons didn't entirely die with the Windkanone. Modern military technology includes long-range acoustic devices, LRAD systems, which use focused sound waves for crowd control and area denial. These systems work at much shorter ranges and against ground targets, but they demonstrate that the underlying concept of using acoustic energy as a weapon isn't completely without merit. The difference is that modern systems are developed with realistic expectations about their capabilities and limitations. Similarly, vortex ring generators, the principle behind Zippermeer's other project, have found peaceful applications. Agricultural hail cannons, used by grape growers in Europe since before World War I, use the same basic principle of generating powerful vortex rings to theoretically disrupt hail formation in thunderstorms. While meteorologists dispute their effectiveness, noting that vortex rings dissipate after only a few hundred feet, the fact that these devices are still in use shows the persistence of the idea. The Windkanone also serves as a reminder of how desperation can cloud judgment. By 1943 and 1944, Germany was losing the war on all fronts. The Eastern Front was collapsing, Italy had surrendered, Allied forces were preparing to invade France, and the bombing campaign was devastating German industrial capacity. In this context, even marginal improvements in defensive capability seemed worth pursuing. If there was even a small chance that the Windkanone might work, might knock down a few bombers, then from a desperate defender's perspective, it might seem worth trying. But this desperation-driven decision-making had costs. Every resource devoted to unlikely wonder weapons was a resource not devoted to more effective alternatives. Germany would have been better served by producing more conventional Flak 88 anti-aircraft guns, more ammunition for existing weapons, more conventional fighters, and better training for pilots. The Luftwaffe's increasingly skilled opponents weren't being defeated by revolutionary technology, but by superior numbers, better logistics, and more experienced pilots backed by massive industrial production. The tale of the Windkanone also highlights the importance of realistic testing and evaluation. The weapon worked after a fashion against stationary targets at close range under ideal conditions. But no one appears to have seriously questioned whether this limited success would translate to actual combat effectiveness. The gap between test range performance and battlefield utility was never honestly assessed, or if it was assessed, the concerns were overruled by desperation and wishful thinking. In the final analysis, the Windkanone sound cannon represents one of the more unusual footnotes in the history of World War II weapons development. It was based on legitimate physics, built by qualified engineers, tested at a proper military proving ground, and even deployed to an active combat zone. Yet it achieved nothing, damaged no aircraft, affected no battles, changed no outcomes. It stands as a monument to the dangers of pursuing novelty over practicality, of confusing theoretical possibility with actual utility, and of how desperation can drive nations to waste precious resources on unlikely solutions. The massive bent tube that stood on that bridge over the Elbe in the spring of 1945, waiting for targets that would either never come or would pass by unscathed, symbolises the final collapse of Nazi Germany's wonder weapon dreams. The Allies didn't defeat Germany by developing death rays or tornado cannons. They defeated Germany through superior industrial capacity, better logistics, more effective use of conventional technology, and the patient accumulation of overwhelming material superiority. When Allied soldiers captured the Windkanone, they captured a weapon that fired air, nothing but air, and achieved exactly what one might expect from such a device. Nothing. Today, the Windkanone exists only in historical records, in a few surviving photographs, and in the accounts of military historians who study the more unusual aspects of World War II technology. It serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive appeal of revolutionary weapons, about the difference between what sounds impressive and what actually works, and about how even the best scientists and engineers can be led astray when working under desperate circumstances for a desperate regime. The Windkanone fired its shots of compressed air, and they dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere, achieving nothing but demonstrating once again that in war, as in physics, reality always has the final word. The photographs taken at Hillersleben in May 1945 show more than just the Windkanone itself. They reveal the broader context of Germany's desperate weapons development program in the final years of the war. The artillery-proving ground had become a repository of failed dreams and impractical schemes. Among the conventional artillery pieces and standard military equipment sat devices that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than serious military procurement. The Windkanone was just one of several air-based weapons being tested at the facility, each representing a different approach to the same fundamental problem of how to stop the seemingly unstoppable Allied bombing campaign. The development timeline of the Windkanone paralleled Germany's declining military fortunes in an almost poetic way. In 1942, when Zippermeyer began his research, Germany still controlled most of continental Europe. The Luftwaffe, though bloodied by the Battle of Britain, remained a formidable force. German cities, while beginning to experience bombing raids, had not yet been subjected to the apocalyptic destruction that would come later. There was still time, still resources, still the luxury of exploring unconventional approaches. By 1943, when serious testing began at Hillersleben, the situation had changed dramatically. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in catastrophic defeat. North Africa was lost, the bombing campaign was intensifying, yet Germany still had industrial capacity, still had scientists and engineers, still had the ability to pursue multiple weapons programs simultaneously. By 1944, when the Windkanone underwent its most extensive testing, Germany was fighting for survival. The Normandy invasion had succeeded. Soviet forces were crushing German armies on the Eastern Front. American daylight bombing raids involved formations of over 1,000 aircraft. British night raids turned entire cities into infernos. Hamburg had been destroyed in Operation Gomorrah. The systematic destruction of Germany's industrial capacity was well underway, yet still the testing continued, still the reports were filed, still the hope persisted that some technological miracle might reverse Germany's fortunes. And by 1945, when the weapon was finally deployed to the Elbe Bridge, Germany had perhaps weeks left as a functioning state. The deployment itself seems almost absurd in retrospect, a gesture toward defence when the war was already lost. The technical specifications of the Windkanone, examined in detail, reveal interesting choices in engineering. The decision to use hydrogen and oxygen as the propellant gases was both logical and problematic. Hydrogen and oxygen, when mixed and ignited, produce one of the most powerful chemical reactions available, releasing enormous energy. The reaction is also relatively clean, producing mainly water vapour and heat. This makes it ideal for a weapon that needs to generate a powerful blast without filling the barrel with solid combustion products that could obstruct subsequent firings. However, hydrogen is notoriously difficult to handle safely. It's the lightest element, which makes it prone to leaking through even small gaps. It forms explosive mixtures with air across a wide range of concentrations. Storage requires specialized equipment. The logistics of supplying hydrogen to a field-deployed weapon would have been considerable. The choice of a 3-foot diameter barrel was likely driven by the need to generate a sufficiently large volume of compressed air to remain coherent over distance. A smaller barrel would produce a narrower air slug that would dissipate more quickly. But the 3-foot diameter also made the weapon massive and difficult to transport. The 35-foot length necessary to channel and accelerate the compressed air blast, added to the logistical challenges. This wasn't a weapon that could be quickly repositioned or easily concealed. Once emplaced, it was essentially a fixed installation, vulnerable to counter battery fire from conventional artillery or attack from the very aircraft it was meant to destroy. The bent configuration of the barrel, while mechanically necessary for directing fire upward, created additional complexity. The sudden change in direction would have caused turbulence in the airflow, potentially reducing the coherence of the compressed air projectile. Engineers would have needed to calculate the optimal angle of the bend to balance the need for high-angle fire against the loss of effectiveness from turbulent flow. The fact that the weapon demonstrated any effectiveness at all in testing suggests they achieved at least a workable compromise, though clearly not one sufficient for actual combat conditions. Loading and firing procedures would have been complex and time-consuming. The combustion chamber needed to be charged with precisely measured amounts of hydrogen and oxygen. The mixture ratio was critical. Too much oxygen, and the explosion would be weak. Too much hydrogen, and you risked incomplete combustion and dangerous residual gases. The ignition system needed to be reliable, capable of detonating the gases at exactly the right moment. Unlike a conventional gun where a shell can be loaded and fired relatively quickly, the Windkanone required careful preparation for each shot. This meant a slow rate of fire, perhaps one shot every several minutes, maybe longer. Against fast-moving aircraft that might be overhead for only seconds, this was a crippling limitation. The comparison with other German experimental anti-aircraft weapons is illuminating. Germany tested numerous unconventional approaches to air defense as the war progressed. There were upward-firing mortars that launched explosive charges on cables, hoping to create aerial minefields. There were rockets with proximity fuses designed to explode near bomber formations. There were even proposals for literally gigantic guns that would fire shells to extreme altitudes. Most of these achieved limited success at best. The cable-launched aerial mines occasionally brought down aircraft, but were far too slow to deploy to be tactically useful. The proximity-fused rockets worked in principle, but required sophisticated electronics that Germany struggled to produce in quantity. The super-heavy anti-aircraft guns existed mainly on paper, requiring resources and manufacturing capacity that Germany no longer possessed. What all these experimental weapons shared was a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem they were trying to solve. The issue wasn't that Germany lacked the theoretical ability to damage or destroy aircraft. Conventional anti-aircraft guns, when they scored hits, were quite effective. The Flak 88, Germany's most famous anti-aircraft gun, was a superb weapon that downed thousands of Allied aircraft. The problem was that hitting fast-moving aircraft at high altitude was incredibly difficult. It required accurate ranging, precise calculation of lead angles, proper fusing of shells to explode at the right altitude, and a fair amount of luck. No amount of exotic technology could eliminate these fundamental challenges. The Windkanone, with its limited range and invisible, rapidly dissipating projectile, made the targeting problem even harder, not easier. German anti-aircraft doctrine by 1944 had evolved into a system called the flak box, where large numbers of anti-aircraft guns would create zones of exploding shells that bombers had to fly through. The goal wasn't necessarily to hit individual aircraft with aimed fire, but to create such a dense pattern of explosions that some shells would inevitably find targets. This doctrine recognized that perfect accuracy was impossible and instead relied on volume of fire. A single Flak 88 battery might fire hundreds of shells at a bomber formation, hoping that a few would connect. This approach required enormous amounts of ammunition, well-trained crews, and good positioning, but it worked, at least to some degree. The Windkanone offered none of these advantages. It couldn't create a zone of destruction through volume of fire. It couldn't be deployed in the large numbers necessary for barrage tactics. It was essentially trying to solve a problem that required quantity with a solution based on novelty. The personnel assigned to operate the Windkanone must have had interesting reactions to their unusual weapon. German soldiers by 1945 were generally experienced, having survived years of combat. They understood weapons and their capabilities. Being told to operate a giant bent tube that fired compressed air at aircraft must have seemed bizarre, perhaps even insulting. These were men who had operated conventional anti-aircraft guns, who understood ballistics and fire control, now being asked to believe that invisible blasts of air could bring down aircraft. The training manuals for the Windkanone, if they existed, would be fascinating historical documents. How do you explain to soldiers how to aim a weapon that fires projectiles they cannot see, that dissipate within seconds, that have no predictable ballistic trajectory? How do you train crews to calculate deflection angles when the projectile doesn't behave like a solid object? These practical questions of implementation may have contributed to the weapon's complete failure in combat as much as its inherent technical limitations, the decision-making process. That led to deploying the Windkanone to the Elbe Bridge reveals interesting aspects of German military organisation in the war's final months. By 1945, the German command structure was increasingly chaotic. Hitler was making major strategic decisions from his bunker in Berlin, often overruling his military commanders. Resources were being allocated based on political considerations as much as military necessity. Different branches of the military and various Nazi Party organisations competed for materials and manpower. In this environment, a weapon like the Windkanone could be deployed not because anyone seriously believed it would be effective, but because it represented the continued pursuit of wonder weapons that Hitler demanded. Deployment, even token deployment, showed that scientists and engineers were still working, still innovating, still trying to produce the miracles that Nazi propaganda promised. The bridge over the Elbe where the Windkanone was stationed had its own strategic significance. The Elbe River represented one of the last significant natural obstacles in eastern Germany. As Soviet forces advanced from the east and Western Allied forces pushed from the west, the Elbe became a crucial line. Bridges were vital for military movement, for evacuation of troops and civilians, for the desperate shuffling of resources that characterized Germany's final defensive efforts. The Allies knew this and targeted bridges relentlessly. Fighter bombers, medium bombers, even heavy bombers were tasked with bridge destruction. A bridge with functioning air defences might survive longer, might allow more troops to retreat westward, might delay the inevitable Soviet advance by hours or days. In this context, any air defence was better than none, even if that defence was an experimental weapon of dubious effectiveness. The fact that no aircraft were recorded as damaged or destroyed by the Windkanone doesn't necessarily mean it was never fired in combat. Military records from the final weeks of the Third Reich are incomplete and often contradictory. Units were disintegrating, communication was breaking down, documentation was being destroyed or lost. It's entirely possible that the Windkanone was fired at Allied aircraft multiple times without effect, and these firings simply went unrecorded. Alternatively, the crew may have recognised the futility of their weapon and chosen not to fire it, saving their lives by not drawing attention to their position. Allied pilots were quick to attack anti-aircraft positions that revealed themselves by firing. A fighter bomber could easily destroy the Windkanone with rockets or cannon fire if it was identified as a threat. The psychological aspect of operating the Windkanone must have been demoralising. German soldiers by 1945 were well aware they were losing the war. Morale had collapsed in many units. Soldiers wanted to survive until the war's end, increasingly likely to be measured in weeks rather than months. Being assigned to operate an experimental weapon that probably didn't work, stationed at a bridge that would inevitably be captured or destroyed, must have seemed like a death sentence assignment. The temptation to simply abandon the position, to flee westward toward American lines rather than be captured by Soviet forces, must have been overwhelming. That the Windkanone was apparently still at its position when Allied forces arrived suggests either remarkable discipline by its crew, or more likely, that it was abandoned so recently before capture that the crew simply ran out of time to move it. After the war, Allied intelligence teams conducted extensive investigations into German weapons programs. The Combined Intelligence Objectives, Subcommittee, CIOS, and the Field Information Agency Technical FE8 sent teams of specialists to examine captured facilities, interview German scientists and engineers, and assess the technological developments Germany had achieved. The reports from these investigations fill thousands of pages and cover everything from jet engines to nerve gas to nuclear research. The Windkanone merited inclusion in these reports, but not extensive analysis. Intelligence officers recognized it as an interesting curiosity, but not as a significant technological achievement worthy of detailed study or potential adoption. This stands in stark contrast to other German weapons that were examined extensively and influenced post-war development. The Messerschmitt Me Tu-62 jet fighters' design informed American and Soviet jet programs. German rocket technology, particularly from the V-2 program, became the foundation for both American and Soviet space programs. German submarine designs influenced post-war naval architecture. German infrared night vision equipment, acoustic torpedoes, and numerous other innovations were studied, copied, and improved upon. The Windkanone, despite being built by qualified engineers using sound physical principles, was simply not worth copying. This practical assessment by experienced military engineers provides perhaps the most damning verdict on the weapon's worth. Mario Zippermeyer's post-war career shift from weapons development to medical treatment is an interesting personal trajectory. Many German scientists who worked on weapons programs during the war continued in military research afterward, either for the Western Allies or the Soviet Union. The Americans recruited hundreds of German scientists through Operation Paperclip. The Soviets forcibly transported German technical experts to work on Soviet projects. That Zippermeyer instead chose to work on therapeutic applications of his air and electrical discharge research suggests either a genuine desire to move away from weapons work or a recognition that his weapons designs had limited value to potential employers. His apparent success in treating respiratory diseases using artificial mountain air created by electrical discharge indicates he was a capable scientist who could achieve practical results when working on problems better suited to the technology available. The cost of developing, testing, and deploying the Windkanone is difficult to calculate precisely, but was certainly substantial. The weapon required specialized materials, skilled labor to manufacture, transportation to testing facilities, and then to operational deployment, and personnel to operate it. In 1944 and 1945, when Germany was desperately short of every resource, these expenditures represented real opportunity costs. The steel used in the Windkanone's barrel could have been used for conventional anti-aircraft guns. The hydrogen and oxygen fuel could have been used in other applications. The scientists and engineers could have worked on improving existing weapons rather than developing new ones. The soldiers manning the weapon could have been fighting elsewhere. When you're losing a war of attrition, wasting resources on ineffective weapons accelerates your defeat. This resource misallocation was a recurring theme in Nazi Germany's military strategy. Hitler's insistence on developing superweapons consumed resources that would have been better spent on practical improvements to existing systems. The massive railway guns like Schwerer Gustav and Dora cost millions of Reichsmarks to build, required entire battalions of troops to operate and protect, and achieved minimal military results. They were impressive as engineering achievements, but useless as weapons. The super-heavy tanks like the Maus and E-100 consumed design resources and manufacturing capacity that could have produced hundreds of more practical medium tanks. The V-2 rocket program cost as much as the entire Manhattan Project, but achieved far less strategic impact. The Windkanone was a relatively minor example of this misallocation, but it was part of a broader pattern of prioritizing the spectacular over the effective. The Allied bombing campaign that the Windkanone was meant to counter had, by 1945, achieved most of its strategic objectives. German oil production had been devastated by attacks on synthetic fuel plants. Ball-bearing production, crucial for every machine with moving parts, had been severely disrupted. Transportation networks were shattered, with railways and canals cratered and blocked. Aircraft production, despite Herculean efforts to disperse factories into tunnels and caves, was falling behind losses. Most critically, the Luftwaffe had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. German pilots by early 1945 were poorly trained, flying inferior aircraft, short of fuel, and facing overwhelming numbers of well-trained Allied aviators in superior machines. Even if the Windkanone had worked perfectly, even if it had been deployed in large numbers, it couldn't have reversed these strategic realities. The technical reports on the Windkanone that survive in archives provide fascinating details about the weapon's construction and operation. The combustion chamber design had to handle extreme pressures and temperatures from the hydrogen-oxygen detonation. The ignition system needed to create a spark hot enough to initiate combustion even in the oxygen-rich environment. The barrel needed to be strong enough to contain the explosion but also precisely manufactured to channel the compressed air blast efficiently. These were non-trivial engineering challenges that German engineers apparently solved successfully. That the weapon failed in combat doesn't mean it was poorly engineered. It means the fundamental concept was flawed for the intended application. This distinction is important. Good engineers can build in effective weapons if the requirements don't match battlefield reality. The fate of the actual Windkanone hardware after its capture is unclear. Most captured German equipment was either destroyed, shipped to Allied countries for examination, or simply left to rust. Given the Windkanone's large size and minimal military value, it was probably destroyed or scrapped rather than preserved. No example is known to survive in museums today. This is unfortunate from a historical perspective, as physical artifacts provide insights that photographs and documents cannot. The exact metallurgy of the barrel, the precise mechanism of the ignition system, the details of the mounting cradle, all of this information is lost. Future historians and engineers can examine surviving German tanks, aircraft and artillery pieces to understand their construction in detail. The Windkanone exists only in records and photographs, a ghost weapon from a desperate time. The bridge where the Windkanone was stationed presumably survived the war, or was quickly rebuilt afterward, as bridges are essential infrastructure that gets repaired quickly even in wartime. The Elbe River today is crossed by dozens of bridges serving modern Germany's transportation needs. Traffic flows across these bridges without any indication that one of them, or a predecessor structure, once hosted one of World War II's most unusual weapons. This erasure of wartime artifacts from the landscape is normal and probably healthy. Societies need to move beyond their conflicts. But it also means that the physical evidence of decisions made, resources expended and hopes invested in failed solutions disappears, leaving only written records that may not fully convey the human dimensions of these stories. The question of what German air defences should have been in 1944 and 1945, given resource constraints, is worth considering. With the benefit of hindsight, the answer seems clear. More of what already worked. More conventional anti-aircraft guns, more searchlights, more radar installations, more ammunition for existing weapons, better coordination between fighter units and ground-based defences, more realistic training for pilots in the time available, focus on defence of the most critical industrial targets rather than trying to defend everything. None of this would have stopped the Allied bombing campaign, but it might have made it more costly, might have delayed Germany's industrial collapse by weeks or months. Every experimental weapon program, including the Windkanone, represented resources diverted from these practical measures. The cultural impact of wonder weapon programs on German public morale deserves consideration. Nazi propaganda heavily promoted the idea that German science would produce miracle weapons that would turn the war around. Newsreels showed rockets launching, jets flying, new tanks rolling off production lines. The message was clear: hold on, trust in German ingenuity. Victory is coming through technological superiority. For a population enduring bombing raids, food shortages, and endless casualty lists, these promises provided hope, however false. The reality that most wonder weapons either didn't work or came too late in too few numbers was carefully hidden. When the Windkanone was deployed to the Elbe Bridge, it's unlikely any public announcement was made. Failed weapons don't make good propaganda, but internally, within the military and industrial establishment, each failure must have eroded confidence in the wonder weapon program overall. Looking at the Windkanone from the perspective of 21st century military technology, we can recognize both where the concept was fundamentally flawed and where the underlying physics remains relevant. The idea of using directed energy as a weapon has proven valid in other contexts. Modern militaries employ lasers for missile defense, directed electromagnetic pulses for disabling electronics, and various acoustic weapons for crowd control. But these modern directed energy weapons work at much shorter ranges against different target types than the Windkanone attempted. A laser can destroy a missile's guidance system or heat its fuel tank to detonation, because it delivers concentrated energy continuously to a specific point. An acoustic weapon can disorient humans because human physiology is vulnerable to certain sound frequencies. Trying to knock an aircraft out of the sky with a blast of compressed air remains impractical because the air dissipates too quickly, and aircraft are specifically designed to handle turbulent airflow. The Windkanone story also illustrates how scientific education and technical expertise don't guarantee good judgment about practical applications. Mario Zippermeyer had legitimate credentials as a physicist and engineer. He understood thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, combustion chemistry, all the relevant disciplines. Yet he apparently convinced himself and others that a weapon with obvious practical limitations could be effective in combat. This disconnect between theoretical understanding and practical assessment happens in many fields, not just weapons development. Experts can become so focused on whether something can be done that they fail to adequately question whether it should be done or whether it will work in real-world conditions. The Windkanone should have died in the theoretical stage, killed by honest assessment of its limitations. Instead, it consumed resources all the way through to operational deployment. The final irony of the Windkanone is that while it achieved nothing militarily, it has achieved a kind of immortality as a historical curiosity. The weapon is remembered and discussed precisely because it was so unusual and so unsuccessful. Conventional German anti-aircraft guns that shot down thousands of Allied aircraft are less interesting to historians and popular audiences than the bizarre Windkanone that shot down nothing. There's a lesson here about how history remembers technological failures. The spectacular failures, the ambitious attempts that fell completely short, often received more attention than the reliable systems that worked as designed but weren't revolutionary. The Windkanone has secured its place in the historical record not through its effectiveness, but through its sheer strangeness.